A man who needs very little introduction. Hedrick is a Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent who has covered dictators in Moscow, Cairo, Eastern Europe, and for the New York Times.
And thank you, Jake, for the mic and for the hall and for sponsoring the event. And thank you all for coming. It's hard to start anywhere in American history without going back to Abraham Lincoln. Such a wise man, not only a great president, but a wise and student of history. And way back in 1838, when he was a young man, more than 20 years before he became president, Lincoln said that if American democracy, representative democracy, the American Republic were ever overthrown, it would be death by suicide. It would not be from a foreign invasion. And remember, in the early 1800s, they literally were worried about being invaded by the French and the British. But he said it's almost inevitable that at some point in American history, there will arise a leader, a demagogue followed by a mob, who will seek to exercise absolute rule and try to attain absolute power. And he said, you know, like Caesar, like Napoleon. Now, we often forget that both Caesar and Napoleon emerged from republics. Caesar overthrew the Roman Republic and changed Roman history for 400 or 500 years. Rome was, after that, an empire ruled by emperors. And Napoleon seized power in a coup about 10 years after the French Revolution, and it took him 4 or 5 more years to solidify his power. And then in 1804, he was crowned emperor in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And the story is that he actually took the crown out of the hands of the Pope and crowned himself. So that is what Abraham Lincoln was talking about in 1838. Donald Trump is what Abraham Lincoln was worried about. Donald Trump, on January 20th, 2025, assumed power of the presidency and claimed the right to rule like an American Caesar. Not like a normal American president, but like an American Caesar. Remember, just the summer before, the Supreme Court had issued a ruling in July of 2024, which said that the president, and remember, Trump was the defendant in this case, so this was not just an abstract comment about any president, that the president cannot be prosecuted for virtually anything he does as part of his official duties. A sweeping grant of immunity. So Trump comes into office with that. He comes into office with Republican majorities in the House and the Senate, and a 6-3 Supreme Court conservative majority. Now, if you're Donald Trump, this is a moment when you go for broke. And that's literally what Donald Trump has done for the last 8 or 9 months. He's gone for broke. He began immediately usurping the powers of Congress to legislate funds and set up agencies and run agencies and set rules for agencies and set up bipartisan boards of regulatory agency. Trump began firing the Democrats on those boards. He began, with Elon Musk's help, they began cashiering agencies like the Agency for International Development, wants to shut down the Education Department, shut down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, all set up by Congress, which in Article 1 is given the power to legislate and manage the government and then fund it. Beyond that, since then, we have watched Donald Trump and his people defy and demonize the federal courts, with the exception of the Supreme Court, call for the impeachment of judges that ruled against Trump. This is not totally new. This has happened occasionally in American history before, but not in the kind of sweeping way that we have seen it. There's no question that we are seeing somebody who is assuming that he can rule as a Caesar. Now, many American commentators and critics have compared Trump to European fascists, to Hitler, to Mussolini. But you know, I have to say, as a longtime foreign correspondent, as I've watched the Trump presidency unfold, and watched the National Guard be sent into Los Angeles and the District of Columbia, and then maybe now he's threatening war against the city of Chicago. Watched masked officers, supposedly of the American government, swoop down on allegedly illegal immigrants and scoop them up, often very much in secret, and either deported them and pushed aside due process, which is to say that everybody has a right to be heard in public. I'm an American citizen. No, you're not, whatever the argument is, but they're entitled to that. That's been brushed aside. And I suddenly thought, and then not only that, we're talking about the fixing of the 2026 elections, either through gerrymandering or blocking mail voting, voting by mail, not voting by mails, but voting by mail, and using voting machines. And I thought to myself, God, I feel like I'm back in Moscow. I feel like I am watching Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin operate from the Kremlin. And I thought, oh my God, Trump is not Hitler or Mussolini, he's Putin's clone. Trump is America's Putin. Now, you may respond to that and say, Rick, you're going overboard. You were a Moscow correspondent. You kind of got a bit of historical, political, journalistic myopia. Well, let me share with you a couple of things. If you think back, Trump has always been captivated by Putin. For years, he pursued Putin for what he thought would be the dream business deal, which would be to build a massive hotel complex just off Red Square, and Putin would have the penthouse free of charge. Didn't get the deal, but he wanted that. But not only was Putin a target of business and an opportunity for business for Trump, he was Trump's political idol. Literally his political idol. Let me read to you for a moment from Michael Cohen, Trump's longtime attorney, fixer, tough guy, in his book. And what he says is that Trump not only was drawn to the superpower of dictators, but he was literally in awe of Putin. And this is what he said in his book. According to Michael Cohen, Trump said, quote, Putin isn't president of Russia, he's the ruler. He's the dictator, the czar. He can do whatever he wants. He's going to be the leader for the duration of his life. He's not just the president, he's the ruler, he's the dictator, he's the czar. He can do whatever he wants. In short, Putin epitomized Trump's power dream. Now let's see whether or not that holds up in practice. Are there parallels between Trump and Putin? Well, they share one thing in common that's very important and that's central. They share the autocrats' lust for absolute power. They want to obliterate, destroy, overcome, overpower any rival power center in their political system. They want total control. They want to bypass the legislature. They want, very importantly, and I'll get into this more in a moment, they want to control the organs of state security. We write about American politics. We don't talk about the organs of state security. We talk about the Defense Department and the Justice Department and the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. But when we're foreign correspondents and we're looking at other countries and how power works, we talk about the organs of state security. That is, the organs, if you can grasp them as ruler, give you a potential chokehold on your society. So that's critically important. Well, they both have been after that kind of control. They use intimidation and bullying to frighten and to curb their enemies. Now, what's also interesting about them, they are seismic disruptors. Most politicians come into power and they really want to advocate incremental change that builds on what's been going on or reverses it a bit. But it's a bit of change, it's not radical change. Not Trump and Putin. Trump and Putin both want to change the world. They want to change the world they inherited. They want to change the established order. Putin wants to fracture NATO. He wants to revive Russian hegemony over Eastern Europe, and he wants to reestablish Russia as a superpower on a par and an equal with the United States. Trump wants to overturn the world trading order. He wants to change the way we do economics, the way we do trade, so that he can restore the supremacy of the United States, particularly in manufacturing. And he wants to unilaterally dictate that to the world, which is very much of what Putin wants to do in Eastern Europe. They both want to project the tough guy image. I've always been amazed as a journalist that almost every picture you see of Trump that he puts out has this perpetual glare. Most politicians want to show you a smile. They want to show you the human side. They want to get you to like them. Not Trump. He wants you to be afraid of him. Putin goes bare-chested when he goes horseback riding, right? He goes spearfishing, whatever. That's his macho. They want to project that. But they also go beyond imagery to the use of force. Putin has used force not just in Ukraine, but in Georgia, all around his southern border. He's fought with the Chechen rebels inside of Russia. He likes to exercise the force of the army. And even though Donald Trump has tried to cast himself as a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, settling wars in Pakistan and India, and I don't know what he's doing in the Middle East. Nobody knows what's going on in the Middle East, but between Russia and Ukraine. Where he feels most comfortable, it feels to me as we're watching him, is sending the National Guard into those cities, is renaming the Defense Department the War Department. Now, who the heck needed to do that? That's an image he wants to project, and then he wants to project it against others. Okay? So there's this use of, also both of them use the big lie to justify their aggression against others. The big lie, that's a common element between the two of them. Putin's big lie, you may not know it, the night before the invasion of Ukraine in February of 22, Putin went on the air and basically he said he had no choice but to attack Ukraine because Ukraine was going to be the stepping stone and the spearhead of an attack on Russia by the West. There was no plan to do that. That is a total lie, and he's stuck with that ever since. But that has been the justification in his mind and to his people for his actions in Ukraine. Trump's big lie, you know about, is all about the 2020 election having been stolen from him, and basically his being the victim of witch hunts for which he now must pay back with vengeance against those who were trying to prosecute him. So those are typical. Those are common elements, and I'll give you some more. But that suggests to me that there's certainly a psychic connection. They share an autocrat psyche. But beyond that, in my mind, there's at least a question of whether or not Trump isn't watching Putin and picking up ideas from Putin. And as president, whether it was in his first term at Helsinki or in his second term in Alaska, whenever he meets with Putin, he gets a total turnaround. He goes in with American talking points and he comes out parroting Putin's line. So there's, you have to ask, why is this going on? People say, is there something Putin has on Trump? I think there is. I think he's got the moxie on Trump. I think it isn't necessarily some blackmail. It is a psychological leadership. He's a stronger role. So the question we have to ask, I think the two questions we have to ask are the changes that we're watching and living through fatal, terminal, and irreversible? And even before that, how do we get into this mess? How did this happen? How can a Trump get away with what Trump is doing? So that leads me into a bit of history for you. The truth of the matter is American government for quite a while has not been operating the way we learned in high school. It is not the separation of powers and the flow of legislation that we all thought before. Yes, that's there. The form is there. But what's happened over the last 90 years is that power has been steadily gravitating from Congress to the presidency. Okay? It begins really with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal in the 1930s. And then it gets accentuated in the Cold War. Here we are, toe-to-toe, face-to-face with the Soviet Union, and we have to have a president who has the power and the ability to move fast. So we have to grant him more power in order to protect us. And then it then got extended by George W. Bush in the terrorism war. You had to have the president who could react to terrorism. So we had a need practically to have the presidency have more power. And then beyond that, we then began to give the presidency mythic status. The president was not just the president of the United States. Almost every time he went, anywhere he went, Madeleine Albright said it about Bill Clinton. He is the leader of the free world. It's as if the American president suddenly became a demigod in our minds, in the way we looked at them. And we all accepted that. And then the presidents began to take actual powers away from Congress. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and George W. Bush led America into wars without the full approval of Congress or by dragging Congress along. That happened. What happened was that in each Congress, if there was a Democratic majority and a Democratic president, the Democratic majority in Congress didn't want to oppose the Democratic president. And the same thing if there was a Republican president. The result was that Congress let this happen. And then at the same time, Congress was becoming more and more dysfunctional. Congress was always intended by the Founding Fathers to work slowly, to deliberate legislation slowly, to creep along, not to rush into new things. But that became much more chaotic, partly as a result of a guy named Newt Gingrich. We go into that in a moment later. But it became much more bound by gridlock. And what happened was, instead of having a bipartisan situation where there was an overlap between the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress, which existed for a very long time, certainly when I went to Washington in the 1960s and on up well through the 1970s, even into the 1980s. But we began to get into this period of tribal partisanship where the parties could barely talk to each other. There was no overlap. And if you compromised with the other party, you were betraying your party. And let me tell you, there's something peculiar about Congress that's very much like high school. There are gangs and there are cliques, and if you're in this gang and this clique, you can't deal with the other gang and the other clique. Congress is actually very much like that. And what happened was Congress became mobilized. So we have a more and more powerful president, and we have a Congress that doesn't know how to work. And then we as a nation, as a people, become much more divided. Much more divided. If you think of the World War II and then you think of the long Cold War period, the enmity with the Soviet Union was something that bound us together as a nation, as well as bound people together in Washington. Republicans and Democrats on opposite sides of all kinds of issues could agree on defense appropriations, or what to do against the Russians. That also affected us. Believe it or not, it was Gorbachev. By ending the Cold War, by taking down the Iron Curtain, by letting the Berlin Wall open up, in a way, he took the fear away, and that dissolved. And there were other things that happened. We got beaten in Vietnam, we got beaten in Afghanistan. A bunch of other things happened that broke up the foreign policy consensus. And then on top of that, starting in the 1980s, we begin to see this growing and now monumental economic inequality. There's enormous hidden and long-term developing antagonism on a class basis between working-class Americans and upper-middle-class Americans and the 1% elite. And that boiled over in 2016. It boiled over not just for Donald Trump, but if you remember, Bernie Sanders ran against the elite, the corporate elite in 2016, and he damn near took the nomination away from Hillary Clinton based on the divisions, the chasm of class economic differences in America, which is radically different from what we had in the 3 or 4 decades after World War II. And then, as I mentioned, we have the growth of partisanship, which divides us. And people no longer just disagree about politics. They see the others as the enemy. So this is the cauldron. This is the mix that Donald Trump walks into, first in 2016, but then he comes back in 2024. And what we've had now, and I just want to go through a few things. There's so many things that have been affected in America. Weather forecasts, science investment, health care, one thing or another. We could talk forever about all the things that have been disrupted. I don't have time for that, neither do you. I want to focus on just a few central institutions and how they've been affected, and then what that means for us. As I said, we saw an unprecedented power blitz from Trump. Now, we'd had plenty of warnings from Trump that he was going to do this, and we had plenty of people, including Kamala Harris, who said she thought Trump was a fascist, but we didn't have any idea what it was going to be like. It was a blitz like von Clausewitz, hit hard, hit fast, no apologies, reach into new territory, ignore your enemies, just roll over them. How did it happen? How did it happen? Well, they were using the 4 years between Trump's first term and Trump's second term. And most of us weren't paying any attention. There was this thing called Project 2025 at the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank in Washington, that people focus on. Trump, of course, denied he had any connection with it. Let me tell you something. The Project 2025 was the tip of the iceberg. There was so much more than that. Now, the guy who was running that in the most important way is a guy named Russell Vought. Russell Vought today is Director of Office of Management Budget. Sounds like a really boring. He is sitting right at the controls, at the heart, at the center of American government. All money has to move through him. And in addition to money, all kinds of administrative decisions. Russell Vought describes himself as a Christian nationalist. In 2023, he said that the Marxists had already taken over America. Now, the Marxists at that point are Biden and Clinton and Obama, right? Okay? It's a Marxist takeover, okay? And he pushes an idea of radical constitutionalism. Now, under his radical constitutionalism, the last 200 years of American history, all those precedents were wrong. The president has to take over. In October of 2024, Russell Vought, who runs a nonprofit that's out to do right-wing reforms, gave a speech. This is before the election, right? A month before the election. Let me read what he said. We have detailed agency plans. We are writing the actual executive orders. We are writing the actual regulations now. Project 2025 didn't have that stuff. That's below the surface. So on day one, when Trump comes in, he's ready to blitz. And the secret to Trump's power and his ability to brush Congress aside are declarations of national emergency. The National Emergency Act of, 1978, I can't remember the year exactly, gives the power to declare emergencies. Now, most of us think of emergencies as, hurricanes or a foreign attack or some sudden event that has upset the apple cart. Think about the tariffs. The emergency for the tariffs is a long-term American trade deficit. So Trump declares in the first 8 days, 8 election emergencies, okay? There's a foreign invasion emergency, which allows him to ramp up ICE and deportations. There's a border emergency, which allows him to move troops to the border. There's a fentanyl emergency, which allows actions against Mexico, Canada, and the drug cartels. There's a trade deficit emergency, which allows the tariffs, and there's an energy emergency to promote drill, baby, drill. Now, what happens is those emergencies then set the platform to issue the stream of executive orders that simply runs over Congress, okay? And then the Congress is so disorganized that it can hardly respond. But in addition to that, there is a Republican loyalty to the president, which many people, probably many people in this room, can't understand. it is not just tribal partisan loyalty. It is fear, and I'll get to that in a moment, but it is also one of the most practical things of politics in America. Politicians pay attention to winners. If somebody's a winner, they want to get on the train with that winner. Now, what you need to know, and probably have forgotten, is that in the 2024 elections, 217 of the 220 Republicans who were elected to the House of Representatives were in districts that were won by Donald Trump. 217 out of 220. So 217 of those people pretty much regard their victory as due to Trump as much as to their own efforts. Okay, that's pretty important. And then in the Senate, the Republicans picked up seats in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Montana, and West Virginia, all states that Trump won handily. So those new senators regard their election as partly attributable, if not mainly attributable, to Donald Trump. So some of this is cynicism, but some of this is the same kind of motive that causes businessmen to do the things they do to make a profit. In other words, you want to stay in office, you stay in good with the guy who helps you get elected, right? Okay, but there also is fear. Trump's first months, 100 days in office are textbook Machiavelli. Remember Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince back in the 16th century. And Machiavelli said at one point that a good leader should want to be loved as well as feared, but if there's only one of those things, it's better to be feared than loved, because fear is something that you can count on people's behavior, and love is not something you can count on with people's behavior. And we have Mitt Romney back in Trump's first term saying there was a climate of fear on Capitol Hill, and that other Republican senators came to him and said that they were afraid for their own safety and their family's safety as they approached the votes on important legislation. And then we have Lisa Murkowski, a really brave, daring, moderate, mainstream Republican from Alaska, saying to a home audience in Alaska, this is an American politician. This is why I say it got me thinking I was in Moscow again. We are all afraid because retaliation is real. And more recently, Trump has been tightening the authoritarian grip in all kinds of ways, mainly through Russell Vought, who's revoking funding that this Congress has voted and that Trump has signed off on. All right, now let's go to the states, organs of state security. It's a wonderful Russian term. It's called siloviki. Sil in Russian means power, means force. They talk about the power ministries, the ministries that can give the leader muscle and terrify the people into submission. And we're talking about defense, intelligence, police, okay? So what does Putin do? Putin can't actually move very fast. He inherits a government from Boris Yeltsin of technocrats and economists and so forth. And he actually has to move slowly in there. But in terms of the Siloviki, the ministries of power, he moves in his old comrades from the KGB unit in Leningrad, where he began his career. And what does Trump do? Trump picks true believers who deny the election results of Joe Biden and who are hostile to the agencies putting them in. Pam Bondi as Attorney General, Kash Patel at FBI, Pete Hegseth at Defense, and Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. So you're putting people in who are out to make the unit either work differently or just have it not work at all. So there's a slight difference, but the parallel, it seems to me, is pretty significant. Then he spreads fear with his unchecked police force. And I have to say that if there is one thing that makes me feel as though I'm back in Moscow, it is the idea of masked police agents conducting secret, unannounced raids on Home Depot, on restaurants, on factories. They just arrested 500 Korean workers who were building a Korean automobile plant in South Carolina. I mean, it's unbelievable. I can remember when I was in Moscow watching a human rights demonstration on December 5th, Human Rights Day, and the demonstrators would unfurl their banners. The KGB had them arrested within 60 seconds. Think about it for a moment. Just think about what masked officers mean. I mean, maybe people should be arrested. They should be arrested directly. They should know who's arresting them. There should be an arrest warrant or whatever. There should be due process and openness. What's the only other major story in the world we watch today where people are masked? It's when Hamas releases the Israeli hostages on television. Is that where we want America to be? Is that where we want America to be? I mean, it just chills me to see that. And not only does it chill me, it violates the Sixth Amendment guarantees of public judicial process, which are written into the Constitution. And there have been a number of court rulings, and particularly in the case of this one Salvadoran Abrego Garcia, who was shipped to El Salvador, has been brought back. Now they're threatening him to ship him out again. At least there's an argument going on about due process, and he's become the ping pong ball in the middle of that. But at least the courts are fighting that, and that's terribly important. Secondly, the rule of law. The rule of law is absolutely critical. Trump has no concept of the rule of law. His concept of the rule of law is pre-Magna Carta. I'm serious. In 1215, King John agreed that he, the king, was subject to the law and that everyone was entitled to due process. Man, I mean, that's 800 years. You know, we think it's big time going back to the American Constitution. For 800 years in Anglo-Saxon law, it has been a fundamental principle that the ruler is subject to the law as others are, and that everyone is entitled to their day in court to defend themselves against whatever charge is brought. It's fundamental. It is the difference between democracy and tyranny. The difference between democracy and tyranny. And we're at that edge right now. Okay? He has turned the rule of law upside down. Think of it. The first act of Donald Trump was to pardon the January 6th rioters. So you free the felons, and now he is prosecuting the prosecutors. He's going after Jack Smith. He's going after the Attorney General in New York and so forth. The reversal is stunning. It is absolutely stunning. We have a lawless president. And then it's interesting how this is working. He is stifling dissent both inside the government and outside the government. One of Trump's first acts was to fire 22 inspectors general. Now, that's one of those kind of hidden things. I mean, Musk is running through, and there are thousands of people being thrown out, and the headlines are all going in there. We're all, wringing our hands and wondering what's going on. 22 inspectors general. They were set up by Congress to be the watchdogs to make sure their agencies abided by the law. They are our ombudsmen inside the government. Trump understood that. Got to get rid of them. One of the next acts was to fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which got a lot of headlines, but in the same day, they fired the top military lawyers in the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. The Stanford University professor said, that's an amazing thing. That's the kind of thing you do when you're getting ready to break the law. Because those are the attorneys who are going to tell you, Mr. President, you can't do that under the law. He didn't want to hear that, so you get rid of him. Okay? In the Justice Department, they transferred out the most senior people in the criminal division and in the national security division so they could put in the people they wanted. You remove people who might disagree with you. Now, bring us up to date. What happened last month was the Bureau of Labor Statistics said they only created 22,000 jobs in August, and Trump fired her. Why? I mean, she's reporting. This is an agency whose job it is to be independent, non-political, impartial. Just deliver the data and let us figure out what to do about it, okay? He fires the commander, the top general at Defense Intelligence Agency. That's the agency, if you recall, that came out of the report just after American B-2 bombers hit those Iranian nuclear facilities. And the guy said, we think preliminarily that the damage was modest, not total. He gets fired, okay? The other day, Robert F. Kennedy, and he gets backed up by the president, fires the head of the CDC. Why? Because she won't fire the scientists who say vaccines work. So disagreement gets equated with disloyalty. And in a unitary executive, disloyalty is a cause for purge. So where are we? At the moment, we are at Trump at peak power. Congress passed the mega bill, the huge, enormous bill that's going to add $3 trillion to the national debt, $3.3 trillion to the national debt. It cut $1.2 trillion from Medicaid and food stamps, and it granted $1.2 trillion in tax cuts to the top 1%. This was a piece of legislation that shifted money from the poor to the richest Americans. I mean, it's incredible when you think about it. Incredible. And you had right-wing Republicans who had always opposed deficit spending, who had always opposed increasing the national debt limit, and they swallowed their objections and went along with Trump. And you had moderate Republicans like Tom Tillis, well, not Tillis voted against it, like Josh Hawley in Missouri and others, who said cutting Medicaid like this was morally wrong and political suicide, which is probably correct, but they voted for the bill anyway. There were only, think about this, this is incredible. There were only 5 negative votes in both houses of Congress to that bill. That is a degree of unanimity of a party that we simply haven't seen in the last 60, 70 years. It's just unbelievable that Congress is that much in the grip of one man. And then we have the National Guard being moved in, and we have the bombing of Iran. So Trump looks unstoppable. Well, I'm finally getting to the point you wanted me to get to in this speech. Don't believe it all. There is a riptide. There is a riptide. You know what a riptide is, where things are moving on the surface water is moving in one direction and the underwater is moving in the other direction. And so there's turmoil at the top. Now, how strong is a riptide? I don't know. We'll have to examine it. But we do need to understand at the moment, and this is a sad statement about the Democratic Party, that Trump's greatest nemesis is not the Democratic Party, it's Donald Trump himself. Trump is an extremist. And extremism is a very high-risk strategy. It has to keep working. It has to feed on itself, or it begins to develop a counteraction, the riptide. And that, I think, is part of what's going on. The mega bill, the monster economic bill, in that bill, Donald Trump was betraying his political base. He was betraying blue-collar America. Now, the question is, are there going to be opponents who can make that case effectively enough to make a difference in the next election? But there's no question he walked away. I just gave you those two numbers, 1.2 trillion, 1.2 trillion. Take it away from the poor and give it to the rich, okay? If you're the opposition party and you can't make a case with that kind of number, you're not very good at your game. But that's there. And there are things that Donald Trump can't control. Donald Trump can't control the economy. Donald Trump can't control foreign powers. And Donald Trump may not be able to control National Guard troops if he sends them into too many cities. I don't know how many of you remember history in the Vietnam War and remember Kent State, when there were protests and a clash, and the National Guard shot and killed students at Kent State University. That is a risk we all face at the moment as a society, and as a leader, Donald Trump faces that risk as a president. The resistance that we've seen so far has come basically only from federal district courts and now a couple of appeals courts. In those first 100 days, there were a huge number of lawsuits, more than 200 lawsuits and more than 150 temporary restraining orders blocking Trump, blocking Musk, but temporarily slowing them down. They got around them. They played cat and mouse with the courts. They damned them. They demonized them. And then in that famous case with Abrego Garcia, the judge in Washington, D.C., ordered the government not to let the planes take off for El Salvador, orally, and then he put it in writing. And a whistleblower has come forward and said that Emil Bove, who was then the acting deputy attorney general and actually the most powerful person in the Justice Department because Bondi had not yet been approved by the Senate, told the Department of Homeland Security that letting the planes take off was consistent both with the law and the court decision, which is a flat-out defiance of the court. So that's the way that has gone, and we're now moving towards the Supreme Court. We're now at a moment of truth where we find out whether or not we have justices or we have politicians in black robes. There are two cases that have been decided by appeals courts. So the next step is to go to the Supreme Court. One is the one that's going to go right away, and the Supreme Court has just set an argument date in November for the decision by the federal court, appeals court, that Trump's tariffs are illegal, that there is no authority in the International Emergency Economic Act that gives him the power to issue tariffs. By the way, the word tariff doesn't even appear in that law at all. So that's going to be decided. And the other thing that's utterly amazing is the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in the South, which is probably the most conservative pro-Trump circuit in the nation, has said that Trump's effort to use the Alien Enemies Act, which is an old 1798 act during the fears of war with France, to try to deport people with that authority, that is illegal, and that's going to have to go to the Supreme Court. So we're approaching the moment of truth on that. But Trump's Achilles heel really is the tariffs, because the tariffs have now caused all kinds of turbulence in the labor market. We clearly have a slowing economy. Addition of jobs, there was just another story in the papers today that the job numbers were even worse than we saw last week. There is the constant fear of inflation, and the Fed has the problem of maybe should we cut the rates in order to get the job situation going and get people hiring again, or should we leave them where they are or raise them because we're worried about inflation? Weak economies are political death to incumbent presidents. You all know, I think, probably that midterm elections are bad for incumbent presidents' parties. I covered the 1982 election under Ronald Reagan, and the Republicans lost 26 seats in that election. Obama, at his 2010 election, lost 60 seats. Trump, in his midterm election in his first term, lost 40 seats in the House. So those numbers are big. Historically, since 1938, it's typical for the in party, the White House party, to lose 27, 28 seats in the House and 3 or 4 in the Senate. Now, is that going to happen? We've got all these games going on, gerrymandering in Texas to try to add more seats for Republicans, also going on in Missouri, may go on in Indiana, and we've got Gavin Newsom in California playing the counter game. It's pretty hard to tell at the moment where it's going to come out. But I think the numbers we're talking about there, if the economy is sour, are modest compared to what the swing is likely to be. And the polls show steady, overwhelming disapproval in the 50, 54, 55% level of Trump's tariffs, of Trump's mega bill, of Trump's economic policy in general. And his own rating is the lowest of an incumbent president at this point in his presidency in the last 40 or 50 years, except for Trump's first term. Okay? So the negative view is out there. The question is, will it turn up at the polls? Will it last? Will the Democrats be clever enough to capitalize on the backlash. We haven't had very many indicators. The one stunning indicator we had was if you remember that election for a Supreme Court judge in Wisconsin. And Elon Musk, at the middle of his Doge phase, went up there to campaign for the conservative. They don't run as Democrats and Republicans. They run as non-affiliated candidates for the court, but one is leaning conservative, one is leaning liberal. Musk went up there. The liberal candidate won by 10%. Musk was clearly a handicap. What is striking about that election is not the margin of victory, because a Democrat, a liberal justice in 2023 in Wisconsin also won by 10%. What is striking is the Democratic voter turnout was up 40% over what it had been in 23. What that says is people are angry enough to go out and do something. Now, that's last April. Is that true now? Is that going to be true in November of 2024? Who can say? There was a little special election in Iowa last week, and a Democratic candidate won by 10% in a district that had gone for Trump 10%, very conservative, very red district. So again, and the issues were economics. So there are a few straws in the wind that economics really matter, and that the extremism of Trump's presidency is negative. The truth of the matter is that the destiny of our republic is at stake in the 2026 election. If the Republicans retain control of both houses of Congress, Donald Trump will be able to continue to do whatever it is he wants to do. And Russell Vought and that brain trust he has have got plenty of ideas for going after all kinds of loopholes in American laws and in the Constitution and the ambiguities. I'm not an advocate for Democrats. Frankly, I'm an independent. But we need a situation in which there is an antipode. There is a counterforce. There is a legitimate hold on power in at least part of our system to pose a serious check on Trump. The only other thing we have is the Supreme Court, and we're all a little uncertain how it will come out. You and I have been watching our politics for the last 30 years. We've been distressed and dismayed at the gridlock. We've been outraged by the chaos. We've been frustrated by the dysfunctional Congress that we have. It's time now to take our anger and our angst and turn it into action. The 2026 election is up to us. This is a test of American democracy, not there in Washington, but right out here on Orcas Island and all across the state and all across all the states where you have friends and children and people you know that you can talk to. Let's get to work. Thank you.
First, thank you. That was extraordinary, and I want to alert you to a mistake in your wiki page, because it says you're much older than you clearly are. But we are at a perilous moment, and I think that you have summarized it extraordinarily well. And I'm curious if you read Ezra Klein on Sunday, who also believes we're at a perilous moment, and is worried that Democrats are polling worse than Republicans are polling at this point. And, you know, Trump keeps winning in the courts, and the midterms are looking like they might be rigged, and he is calling for the Democrats to not fund the government at the end of this month. He says that's what they need to be doing at this point, is to stop funding the government so Trump can't keep doing what he's doing. And I was wondering what your opinion was about that.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. First of all, I don't think it's my job as a reporter, it's appropriate for me as a reporter to map out Democratic strategy. I don't think my nonpartisan role takes me there. But I did read Ezra Klein. And I noticed at the end of the article, he kind of pulled back from that recommendation. But I don't think that's the point. I think Ezra Klein hit something that was very important. What's going on now is we don't have a national debate. We only have one side of the debate. We only hear what Trump says, and then the reporters run around and they get a few Stanford professors and Harvard professors and economists and so forth for the bottom of the story. And so the Democrats are looking for a platform. They're looking for a moment when they can share at least the bully pulpit and talk to the nation. And he's right. The moment when you start to talk about a budget is a moment when you can seize national attention. Now, what I've noticed in a few years past, without recommending a strategy, is that we have had a number of times when we've had a temporary pause and we've pushed the ball down 6 weeks, and then a month, and another month, and another month. Well, if I were a Democrat and I wanted a chance to talk to the nation, I'd be inclined to do that because I get 4 chances of doing that, not just one. And I keep bringing it back. That's the first thing I do. The second thing I do, I think I have a question of whether or not the Democrats are really listening to the nation. There is poll after poll after poll that is telling you more people are saying we have been harmed by Trump's tenure than have been helped. How? Those are people I think the Democrats ought to be hearing. Secondly, they're already working on this bill. I don't know anything about what's in this bill except one thing. There's a plan to cut $44 billion more for scientific research. Scientific research is the key to American competitiveness globally. Why would any sane leader do that unless you were anti-science for some other reason, okay? Stalin was anti-science, but for ideological reasons. So I would go and see what are the items in that bill that symbolize and frame the issues that most aggravate the people who voted with Trump, not with Kamala, with Trump. Those of us who are upset about what I've been talking about, the destruction of American democracy or the threat to it, we're all convinced, but we were 47.8% or 48.7%. The 49.9% that went for Trump are the people we're after. What are the issues in that bill that matter to those people? And then I would hit those issues. I'd pick 3. When Bill Clinton faced Newt Gingrich in 1995 over the budget and Gingrich shut down the government, Clinton came back and says he's cutting education, he's cutting environmental protection, and he's cutting health care. He's cutting environment, health care, he's cutting education, and he did it again and again and again, and Gingrich had to back down. I think that kind of tactic is a lot smarter than just shutting down government. Because if he shuts down government, you know what's going to happen? The next day, Donald Trump is going to stop everybody's Social Security check, and then the Democrats are going to get blamed for that. He has too many action options as president. He has enough agility to outmaneuver them. What they have to do is outthink him.
And who? I mean, who do you see
Well,
as
that's a
having that
question.
potential?
I mean, that may be the heart of the problem. I mean, Ezra Klein sort of got into that. Chuck Schumer, whether or not the leadership is up to what it should be. But there are people. I mean, Bernie Sanders is talking about it. Elizabeth Warren's talking about it. Chris Murphy is talking about it. There are people in the Senate that are hitting issues. They're not leaders. That's something else. I can't deal with that. But I do think that I would say shutting down the government is not a winning strategy. I've covered several government shutdowns. I don't know of any time that the people who shut down the government won politically in the long run. It doesn't matter, well, they're mostly on the Republican extreme side, but I don't think there were any winners. So I don't think that's a winning strategy, but I understand his saying, this is a moment to seize. But they should be seizing it right now. The stuff is the bill is there. The content that you want to attack or dispute is there. And I'm not hearing anybody talking about it.
Mainly me because the media is not covering it, but I appreciate this. I'm not going to dominate this conversation, but thank you very much. That was great.
Hedrick, I think you're a national treasure, and we're so fortunate to have you as a member of the Orcas community.
Thank you.
Now, I'm glad you just mentioned science. It wasn't part of what I was thinking. But it's a battle I have been fighting because it's really a nonpartisan issue, or a bipartisan issue. And we've been winning recently in a number of votes. I've been writing about it in the Seattle Times and in the Washington Post. And with some allies around the country, we've been winning. But I have a question for you. You've been in Washington for decades, and you've had, what, now 25 summers here in Orcas Island, so you understand both communities. What, if anything, can we do in the Orcas Island and the wider San Juan Islands community that would have impact in Washington, D.C.?
Well, first of all, you have to start at home. I remember at one point I was giving a speech at a church in southwestern New Hampshire, and a woman got up and she said, started talking, she said, "This Ted Cruz is just terrible. What can we do about Ted Cruz?" I said, "Ma'am, you live in New Hampshire. There's not a damn thing you can do about Ted Cruz." You know, so focus on New Hampshire. So the first thing you do is you focus on Washington State. You want to make darn sure every single Democrat who's got a seat in this state, not just your own member of Congress for this district, but every single one of them is reelected. Now, you got one that's a bit wobbly on where she stands on some of the issues, but it's still better to have her there. And then you need to look to see whether or not there are any others that can be switched, that can be rolled over. The other thing I think is, I think if you have a real acute sense, as you do, I know from knowing you, an acute sense of how acute the situation is and what the neuralgic points are, then you need to deal with whatever network you have in other states that are critical. The Senate race in Ohio next year is going to be critical. Sherrod Brown is going to run again against an appointed replacement for J.D. Vance. Okay,
He's one of my favorites.
Yeah. Well, okay, but they need help. Postcards, letters. You know, a lot of people don't have much money, so it's not money they can contribute. It's time and effort. You know, and the same thing is true in North Carolina. There's a very important seat in North Carolina that's going to be open because Tom Tillis is not running again. And maybe in Iowa. Joni Ernst has just announced that she's not going to run again in Iowa. So there's beginning to be some indicators that there's some softness in the Republicans. And I think you want to take advantage of that. And they're wonderful organizations, I won't go through the names, that are working nationwide that are not necessarily labeled Democratic Party, Democratic this or that. And so I think people can do that. And then talk to young people. A lot of us in this room are grandparents, and a lot of us in this room are parents. And I think talking to young people about the stakes in this election and how important it is critical. And let me tell you, the young went the wrong way in the 2024 election, and it was striking. The 18 to 30 vote, particularly men, young men, they swung to Trump significantly. So it sounds like it's corny, but it's not. And there's time. There's time now. We have a year. We can work on it.
I'd also like to point out, people don't all know this, but we have 2 senators in this state who are in very influential positions. Although they're in the minority, they're the ranking minority members in very powerful committees. Both Patty Murray in Appropriations and Maria Cantwell in the Commerce Committee. And they can be approached and be very important in helping make the decisions that are getting made.
Thank you for your supplement, which was great. Thanks. Yes.
Hello, thank you so much for this talk. I think it's really important that we all can get together and have these conversations.
Good.
One of the things I've noticed recently is, well, since the election really, some of the top Democrats like Gavin Newsom and some of the others have been very humble about the losses that the Democrats have taken and trying to rework the Democratic Party and saying, you know, they have to have a new approach. But there's also been a movement among liberals to call a constitutional convention, to try to change the Constitution in ways that will prevent this from happening again. I can't remember which of the founding fathers it was, maybe Hamilton, I can't remember, that warned about the power of political parties.
Almost all of them.
Almost all
of them. Madison, Washington, Jefferson.
Yeah.
Adams.
So my question is, I worry about I think there are some changes that need to be made, but I worry if there were a constitutional convention, the right would take it over and make the changes that they want to
You're
make.
absolutely right.
So,
Wait a second.
yeah.
Let's don't skip over that.
yeah,
The right and the Republican Party is much better organized
Yeah.
to take over a constitutional convention. The constitutional convention has no limits. It can be called for one issue or another issue, but there are no limits on it. It's an extremely dangerous. Approach. And I would caution anybody not to push it. And we do have, I'm writing a book and I have a whole chapter on reforms. I'm getting rid of that chapter because we got to get to the point where we can get to the reforms. So, I mean, I think that the immediate needs are addressing the crisis we're facing.
I agree. I also would be very curious to know what you think the reforms could be that would make the difference so that
Well,
we
the
don't
first-
have three branches
Yeah,
of
well,
government.
the first thing to do is
under
there's got to
one
be
control.
there's going to be a huge rewrite of the law that grants the president the power to declare emergencies. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in terms of the Alien Sedition Act and the Insurrection Act, there have to be much stronger language written into those acts that require the president to report to Congress, to seek Congress's control, to have an expiration date, 30 days, 60 days on the use of force. So, I mean, there are specific things that need to be written into laws that are there now. But those are the main ones, the emergency powers and the use of force in the side of the country. And probably some amendments need to be done to the Posse Comitatus Act, which is an act in the 1880s, which limits what federalized National Guard troops can do in the way of law enforcement. And there's pretty good indication from the use of the troops in Los Angeles that troops violated the Posse Comitatus Act. That was the ruling of the judge in San Francisco. And he actually cites evidence and he cites officers, quotes them and so forth. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that case goes, if it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. But I mean, there are very specific laws that need to be addressed, and they can be. But Congress has got to be serious about it. I mean, after Richard Nixon, there were a number of reforms that were put in, but Congress put them into law and then forgot about them and went to sleep. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It's a continuous game.
It doesn't still answer the question of political parties, because even if Congress takes back the power that's allotted to them in the Constitution and the presidential power gets limited, the political parties are still...
Oh, God, I love you. You're
right?
wonderful. I couldn't have planted a better person in the audience. I am a strong believer in nationwide gerrymander reform, and I'm a strong believer in nonpartisan primaries. That, if you start to have nonpartisan primaries, as you have in the state of Washington, if you had them in 8 major states, Congress would start to work again, I believe. So I think you're absolutely right on.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for coming to this community. This dialogue that you lead us in, but this dialogue that we have as a community is really important, I think, to democracy and the future of democracy. So a little bit of preamble to the question I'm getting to. When I listen to the tone, the vocabulary, and the lens of these discussions, I hear a few things. I hear a tone, your call to action used terms like take your fear, channel your angst. Just a moment ago, we described this as, it's not a spectator sport, it's a sport, which implies undertones of competition. The lens that a lot of this discussion has happened is through I'll call them the corridors of power, through what the branches of government do, through what we codified in our laws. And there are certainly many things broken. Would not disagree with that. But my question is, how much of, there's that pithy saying of the people get the government they deserve and the leaders they deserve. How much of what's happening here do we look in a mirror? Is what's going on in Congress, is the fact that our Congress people have a higher allegiance to being reelected than to the Constitution they swore to. How much of that they are tribal in their loyalties is a reflection of We the people, we the community, that is how we are viewing this. This is a lens that I hear many conversations through. Well, you know, as Republicans are doing awful things, and as Democrats, we've got to do this. I don't hear a lot of conversations of we as a people trying to form a more perfect union need to work together. We have differences, but we need to work together. So I want to ask, how much of what's going on is a reflection of what we the people do, and what responsibility do we as citizens, not as Democrats or Republicans, have?
Well, let me thank you for a thoughtful question. That's a great question. I was trying to suggest in that brief historical section of my talk, suggest that Trump didn't just appear, but there were a lot of other things that happened. And one of the things that has happened was the retreat of lots of people from involvement. But I didn't have time in this, but I've written about it a lot in the past. There are very strong, active reform movements pushing for gerrymander reform, and they achieved it in California and Michigan and Colorado because people in those states said, we got to do something about this and fix it and stop blaming one party or the other. And, you know, there are nonpartisan primaries now in Alaska. Believe it or not, there were citizen movements for nonpartisan primaries in North Dakota, in Arkansas, and in Florida in the last election. So I think there are people around the country that are doing exactly what you're talking about. It doesn't raise to the radar level of the national media very much. They're very much state-centered. And in my opinion, that's a good thing. They should be state-centered. I think if we're going to fix this country, we're going to fix the country state by state. The famous reform movements that we've had in the past in our history have basically bubbled up from the states. I mean, the progressive movement in the early 20th century was really, you know, it came out of Wisconsin, came out of Minnesota, but it came out of lots of other places as well. So I would agree with you. We do need to look at ourselves. And I did end up by saying, it's up to us. It's our shot here. We're the ones who have to do it. But we have to do it with a mindful strategy. You can't just say, well, we're going to vote for one side or another. I don't believe we're going to fix this country without bipartisan coalitions. I don't think there's a chance in hell. I mean, if you look at Gallup's personal identification of parties, the Democrats at 29%, the Republicans are 31%, and independents are 40%. I mean, when are the independents going to get to, they can vote in this state in the primary, but in most states in the country, they can't vote in the primary. And in most House races, 90% of House races are decided in the primary, not in the general election. So we have to understand the disconnect between the way our politics are operating and our desire to get engaged, and then figure out how we engage to get the politics to work so we have the power instead of the politicians.
Thank you.
I'm not sure you felt as though I answered you, but I really believe that it's not about debating. There's a really good organization in Washington State called Democracy First. If you want to talk to people who are engaged in trying to fix democracy in this state, gerrymandering in the state legislature, go talk to Democracy First. I mean, there are people at work in this state doing that, and they're very good.
That's fair. Then if I have a brief follow-up just to complete that, I was maybe thinking their thoughts on the debate. I understand that I have a very that the sentiment I express is a very idealistic one. And the balance at the moment between the idealism that I think we should strive for and the pragmatism of the crisis that we face, and how do you balance those two in your own mind?
I look as an idealist at the kind of government and the kind of society that I want to have and that I thought we had, even with lots of imperfections. And I see where I see the shortfall, and I say that's where I got to get to work.
Thank you.
Wow. Beautiful. I'm glad he went first because I changed my question. Mike and
I just want to tell you, I changed my answer already.
Mike and I were really fortunate to see Lech Walesa Monday night in Seattle. It's the first stop in his tour all over the U.S. Lech Walesa being the prior president of Poland who helped start Solidarity and, you know, the big movement back in the Clinton administration. He actually did a little bit what you did in your talk with us tonight, which was present an overview of the world order, then give a little historical background on how he rose. And one of the things that he said was that the world order is in between eras. But it got confused when Putin came back to lead. So having him say that made me think about our era as a democracy, and if you feel that we're in between democratic eras as well. I thought it was just a fascinating statement, and I wanted to kind of lay it on your lap to see what you felt.
You know, well, for a long time, as a student in college, and then as an adult, and then as a journalist, I thought of the alternating poles of American history between periods of conservatism and periods of and consolidation and periods of progressivism and change. And you can go back, you know, different historians have done that over periods of time. The Schlesingers were famous for the pendulums of history swinging every 36 years or every 32 years, you know, and they made it fit pretty well. I have to say, I bought that for a long time. But do you know what a hockey stick looks like? That's where we are now. We've just had a hockey stick, okay? And it's off the charts. It doesn't fit in that pendulum thing again.
You mean the U.S.? The U.S.
I'm talking about the U.S.
Right.
You know, I'm having a lot of trouble dealing with the U.S. Dealing with the whole world, I got to leave that to Lech Walesa, okay?
That's right.
Well, no, I mean, I think if you look at the world, authoritarianism has really been on the rise after a period where democracies looked as though they were on the rise. But I don't know whether or not that's a trend or it just happened in certain societies. But I would say I don't see us in that kind of situation now. I see us it's a very perilous moment. And we can save it. There are countercurrents. I believe that, well, in the first place, in the last election in 2024, 5% of registered Republicans voted for Kamala Harris. They did not vote for Trump, okay? So the notion that there's a monolithic Republican Party or even a monolithic Democratic Party, actually the Democrats were more loyal in terms of percentages, not in terms of absolute numbers. So I believe that if the voters were to register a verdict, it simply says, not I'm for Democrats, but I'm not for this kind of extremism. We need to slow down. We need to be able to talk to each other again. If somebody wants to change the budget, you need to propose a budget to Congress. Congress needs to vote on it, and the president needs to respect it. We need to get back into a game with some rules that we can recognize and live by. If that verdict gets registered, I believe you're going to see Liz Cheney's reappear in the Republican Party. But at the moment, they're scared stiff, and they see no point. Sticking your neck out now is just a way to get it chopped off for no good whatsoever. And so that's the reason why I'm back with the fellow who just spoke. We the people have got to speak. We the people have got to say, you know, this has gone too far, and it isn't just the folks in this room. It's part of that 49.9%. And believe you me, 2 or 3 or 4% of that slid over in the last 6 weeks. And I don't know if you just saw the statistics reported today in the papers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics now says that there were 900,000 fewer jobs created in the last 9 months of the Biden administration and the first 3 months of the Trump administration. Well, had we known that, well, maybe that's why there were so many people who voted against the Democrats. We were operating with a wrong informational base. And it may be that economics mattered more than we realized, but we didn't know what the real economics were, but the people out there who didn't have jobs, they knew. So, I mean, I think we're in a very practical situation. Back to that earlier question. I mean, there are going to be nearly 12 million people in America that are going to lose health care because of the mega bill. 12 million people. There are 4.5 million people who are going to lose it at the end of this year because the subsidies that help them afford to pay for Obamacare are going to disappear. Well, that's painful to a lot of people. There are at least 20 Republicans in the House of Representatives who represent districts where at least 30% of the constituents are on Medicaid. Now, if those people understand what this government has done, then the power of the vote should give them a chance to say whether or not this is the kind of government they want. And I think that's where we are. I don't think there's I don't see any pendulum at the moment.
That's good
I'd
news.
like to see one.
That's good news.
Thank you. I think we got to bring this to a close. You guys are the last two, okay?
Thank you for the overview and the slimmer of hope at the end. I can understand why Congress is being dominated by Trump, their fear of being primaried. But why is the Supreme Court giving him almost everything he wants? They're overruling the lower courts in his favor continuously. These are people who are in power for life. Where's their courage? Have they bought into Project 2025?
Well, I got to tell you, part of the difficulty, I want to tell you something. I've asked myself that question about 1,000 times, okay? So I'm right with you. I'm going to try and give you a little bit of an answer, but I'm not a specialist on the court. It's very important that two justices, including the Chief Justice, are former attorneys in the White House environment. And so they see the problems of government from the president's viewpoint. They see the problem of enforcing the laws. They see the problems of enacting legislation, but particularly enforcing the laws. And so they're ideological. They're ideologically sympathetic to the president, to the presidency, okay? In my opinion, there are at least two other justices who are politically committed. I may be wrong, but I think Justice Alito and Justice Thomas will vote for almost anything that Donald Trump wants, okay? I hate to say that, but I don't think, I think there's behavior that they have shown, particularly in the case of Alito, the flag outside of his home that was sympathetic to Trump. I mean, I find it unbelievable that the court itself didn't have to discipline a justice for showing, and blame it on his wife and say, you know, I don't run the family. I mean, that's not about running the family. It's about how he is represented to the American public. Okay? So I want to see how they vote on those two issues that I laid out before, on tariffs and on the Alien Enemies Act. If they don't oppose him on those, if they don't say, the issue is, does he have the authority in the International Economic Emergencies Act to do tariffs? The act doesn't use the word tariffs. It does say the president can regulate commerce, but it doesn't say tariffs. And there are other laws that were passed that specifically give the president tariff powers. So if Congress left it out, they left it out on purpose. If the court isn't moved by that, it's a political court, in my opinion. And the second one is the Alien Enemies Act. And the Alien Enemies Act says that if you want to use military force, there has to be either a rebellion or an invasion. Now remember, those acts were written in 1797 when there actually was a danger for the new American Republic of both rebellion and invasion. 200 years later, we're in a totally different world, and if Mexico isn't invading us and Canada is invading us, a whole lot of Venezuelans and Chinese and other people that we may not want don't constitute an armed invasion. If the court can't see that, then I'm past belief that they are a court, that they're rendering political judgment. So my prayer and my hope is that they will actually enforce the law. I think they're afraid of Trump. I think they're not only afraid of Trump personally, but they're afraid of the moment that they issue an opinion and the president says, third finger, okay? But the problem is if they don't issue that, they've done the third finger to themselves before the president got there. So we're at a serious moment of truth in American history for the Supreme Court. We've never been quite here before. I mean, Marbury versus Madison, which is the basic court decision that gave the court the power to assert itself as the arbiter of the Constitution. And even in that case, Chief Justice Marshall, was afraid that Jefferson might not abide by it. So this is not a new problem in American history. You know, it's like, who was it said? The Pope doesn't have any troops. Well, the court doesn't have any troops. You know what I mean? So we're at really delicate moments in American history in lots of ways. Thanks. I want to thank you, audience, for your paying attention. My pleasure. Thank you. Appreciate it.